we go. Good morning, everybody. There's not really that much to say now after all of those talks. I think they've pretty much covered everything, but I'm still going to talk anyway. So, going back to my questions from yesterday, what we're trying to get at here is the data. So, what is going on, where's it happening, how often, and so on. And thinking about this is a few different data types, I guess, that you could consider you could be collecting. So you could just collect presence. So if you see something happening, you make a note of it. And as Nico said, that's often what happens. You hear from the observers that they saw whales. But the problem with that is that it doesn't really help you unless you've got the zeros as well. So you need to know, ideally, when the absences, where there's true presence and also where there's true absences. So it's really, really important that you collect the zeros as well. And so you can see, for example, from the French experience that you have to have that loop where you go from trying to collect the data, you look at the data you've collected, and then you go back to the observers or go back to the people that are filling out the logbooks and make sure they understand what you want and refine your data collection accordingly. Then once you've got presence and absence, you start to have a much more powerful ability to say what's going on. So you can start to do things like maps. So I've seen maps of where depredation's happening yesterday and today. And you can start to do some of these models like Megan was describing, where you can correlate other data with where you're seeing the depredation. So you can look at things like, is it particular vessels that are having the problem, particular gear types, is it particular times of the year, and so on. And scientists have many, many very powerful statistical tools available to them to analyse this data. So once you've got that data, then you need to find a scientist and pin them down and say, do the analysis, because once you've got that data, you can actually do it. And then if you start to get a little bit more data, so numbers as well, like Nico was describing, then you can go a little bit further as well and see if there's things like a dosage effect. Is there more whales? Is that a bigger problem, or is it just presence and absence that's the most important thing? And then sort of, I guess, the gold standard, which we're seeing in the CSWAP program and also at Crozet and Kerguelen, is having some sort of additional sighting, resighting program. Quite expensive, quite involved process, but again, it gives you this really important data that might be really important, which tells you about the predator population themselves. So how big is the population? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Are there particular demographic structures there? So for example, are you only getting males depredating? How are they moving and all that sort of stuff? And as I said, we've seen some excellent examples of that. But if you were going from scratch, this is what I would suggest you should be thinking about. What sort of data are you going to collect? What question are you trying to answer? So, for example, in the Chilean circumstance, we heard yesterday, I think they're at the stage where they've got some presence-absence data. It's time to get a scientist in, sit them down or chain them to a chair somewhere and get them to analyse that data, because I think that's going to really help understand what's going on. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about Heard Island and depredation there. So we have sperm whales there. They do actually exist. We believe that the observers are correct because they've sent us these photos, and as far as I can tell, they are sperm whales. But if you look back at, so this is just a presence map of sperm whales. So this is based on historical harvest during the whaling years back in the 20th century. You can see all those little black dots. It gives you a bit of an idea about where the whalers would go to harvest their whales. And what was interesting to me this is on Wikipedia, I didn't make this map, I'm lazy, I just found it on Wikipedia, but you can see that Heard Island, which is there. So if you don't know where Heard Island is, so it's just there. There's Kerguelen, that's Heard Island there, and Macquarie Island is there. So they're where Australia's big Patagonian toothfish fisheries are. And what you'll notice is there's not a lot of black dots there. So it was never a particularly whaley place, if you know what I mean. So even before the fishery started, you may say, well, we don't expect to have a lot of activity involving sperm whales. But then if you look at the Gulf of Alaska, it's kind of not very whaley from this data set either, so it just shows you a bit of the limitation of using presence-only data. But Reese and our observers had collected data over about 5 years, and so we were in a position to start to do some analysis. And what we found was that the incidence of whales, so this is a map again of Heard Island, so there's Heard Island. This is the bathymetry around Heard Island, sort of approximately down to 3,000 metres, which is the extent of fishing. The blue boxes are where long lines have been set, so you can see the pattern of fishing changes over time. And these pink dots are where whales were sighted, so you can see that changes in time as well. So in 2011, all the sightings were over here on the western side of the plateau, and then 2012 they were mainly here around a feature called Shell Bank. 2013, bit of both, and so on. But what became very clear when we analysed this data was, well, you know, there's not sperm whales everywhere for a start, but nearly all of the sightings occurred in the early part of the season, so between May and June. So our fishing season goes from April through to November, and that's designed to avoid seabirds, which are much more active during summer, the austral summer. But then the other thing we found was, despite hearing anecdotally from the fishermen that, yeah, there's sperm whales everywhere, they're not. They're about 3% of lines were being depredated. So I guess it's an example of the importance of actually using the data to analyse the pattern rather than just relying on anecdotes. Because, yeah, I mean, I guess if you're out there fishing, having whales steal your line is one of the more memorable things that happens. So, I guess in some respects it was pleasing that once we looked at this data, well, it was useful for a start, but it also showed that we don't have a huge problem with sperm whales. And the other thing was that it shows that even though the fishery is expanding, the incidence of sperm whale depredation isn't increasing at this stage. So it's actually declining a little bit. And part of the reason why we think that is that the sperm whales are not resident at Heard Island. They're transiting. They're probably males that are transiting from Antarctic waters during summer, and they're moving up towards to live around the convergence, sort of closer to Kerguelen Island, which is where, you know, they hang out and depredate on the Kerguelen and Crozet fishery. So as we start to develop more photo identification data, it wouldn't surprise me if we're starting to see some matches between the whales that are transiting through Heard Island and then being more resident around the French EZ. Then this is another one, I mentioned this yesterday. It's kind of surprising to me that given that southern elephant seals overlap almost exactly with every Patagonian toothfish fishery in the world, Heard Island seems to be one of the few places where we have quite a lot of interactions. We kill about 30 of these guys over the entire duration of the fishery. So the way that's observed is they'll come to the surface entangled in the main line and they'll have drowned. Or occasionally they'll come up with a hook through their nose, and sometimes they'll get away or sometimes they'll already have been drowned. The thing is with these is that they can dive all the way down to more than 1.5 kilometres and sit there and forage along the lines, and you may not even see it. It's very, very rare to observe elephant seals on the surface in the Southern Ocean. There's one instance, I think, in South Georgia where somebody saw an elephant seal on the surface eating a toothfish, but that was enough to write a paper. Like, it's so rare to see this happen. So there's probably quite a lot more cryptic depredation going on than we know. The only reason we had this photo, so this is at 1,400 metres, the only reason we had this photo was because we were looking at the interactions between longlines and the benthos, so the things that live on the seafloor. And we were surprised that in 3 different instances we saw elephant seals come into the frame, swim along, sniff the line, grab fish and things like that. So we did a little bit of modelling. So this is for all the statistics geeks out there. This is a generalised additive model looking at the influence of the amount of fishing effort and the time of year and going through time, looking at effectively the catch rate of elephant seals. And so you can see here that the catch rate, so the number of elephant seals that die per million hooks set in the fishery, is reasonably constant. But as the fishery is growing, the number of seals that are dying is growing a little bit. So we would expect, you know, in a typical year where you're setting about 6 million hooks at Heard Island, that about 2 or 3 elephant seals will die. But what's also clear from this modelling is that the main season when the seals are being killed in the lines is the winter. So they're less common at the start of the season and a little bit less common towards the end of the season. And I went and talked to a elephant seal biologist, because there is one at the Australian Antarctic Division, and he showed me this, which is I guess a life cycle of the elephant seals. So this is the fishery at Kerguelen. So you can see it goes from January, there's a bit of a break in February, March, and then all through the year. At Heard Island, there's a break across summer, and then we start fishing in April through to November. This is the numbers of elephant seals that have been killed in the different months. And this is the sort of life cycle of the seals. So the adult males are molting or breeding during January, February. Then they're out at sea. Is it the other way around? Sorry, they're out at sea and then they're molting and breeding in these areas. So they're actually out at sea, and that's why they're vulnerable to being caught. Females, they have a slightly different timetable, so they're out at sea a bit longer during the fishing season. And then the juveniles are out at sea pretty much the whole time. More during this period, but they're out at sea the whole time, and so they're much more vulnerable to being caught by the fishery. But one of the things about southern elephant seals is most males never ever get to breed, because they have these very aggressive, you know, beach masters, these really enormous fat male elephant seals. They'll sit there and they'll fight off a lot of the smaller males, and a lot of males never ever get to breed. So from a conservation perspective, it's really important for us to know the sex of the animals that are being killed, because if we're killing mostly juvenile males, it actually doesn't matter. So it matters to them, obviously, but to the conservation of the species, it's not as important. So the conclusion from this is that it's now really important that we get the sex of the animals that are being caught, so we can see if we're going to have an impact on the population in the longer term. So, sort of in conclusion, you know, it again depends on what question you're trying to answer as to what data you're going to collect. And from what we're hearing over the last couple of days, we're all in slightly different stages of data collection or analysis for the different fisheries. But in general, I would say you need to collect at least presence and absence all the time, everywhere, because otherwise you're going to have biases in how you interpret what's going on. And then once those patterns are analysed, as I said, you want to have this virtuous cycle where the data analysts are talking to the people that are out on the boats collecting the data to make sure that they understand how the data was collected, any biases that may have crept in, and then you can refine your data collection program. So for example, in the Chilean circumstance, again, I'd say it's time to get a scientist on board, explain to them how the data's been collected on board those vessels, start to do some analysis, and then you'll be able to refine that data collection program so you can start to answer some of the key questions that you want to answer. So that's enough from me on that. I've actually got a video of the elephant seal attacking the line, which is kind of cool, so we might play that during the break. But that's that for the moment. So I'm now, thanks.